One of the most common questions I get is, what do I do first? I have a lot of videos on restoring a lot of different things. A lot of information is available on the internet, but what can I do to optimize the process for feeling better and moving better? Within my biomechanics programs, I have systematized a three-phase progression in terms of restoring certain movement options, ranges of motion, and joint position before others, because in order for us to move to a certain range of motion, we have to start in a relative position of neutrality. And this is what I mean by that. In order for us to go forward with our pelvis, we have to start from a position where we aren't already forward. We can't really get somewhere we're trying to go if we're already there. So we need to start in a position where we are relatively oriented backwards in order for us to go forwards. In order for us to turn to the right, we have to be able to start from a place where we are relatively neutral or in some degree of leftward facing turn. If my hand is already pronated, I'm not going to be able to further pronate it very effectively. I have to start from a position where I can move into that pronation if I want to fully achieve that range of motion. There's a lot of different examples we can use, but generally speaking, this is why we want to address orientation of the entire body as a whole. I have made the distinction in the past of the difference between relative motion and orientation. Relative motion are these different segments moving on one another, whereas orientation of a pelvis is just the whole thing moving as one unit, or within the rib cage or thorax, that would be the whole thing moving as one unit without any relative motion of the shoulder blade on the rib cage with the arm. So we want to be able to first orient our body in the right way to achieve a position of neutrality. And it's important to recognize that neutrality is not an end destination, it is the starting point. We need to become relatively neutral first for us to then be able to move into those joint positions. It's not that neutrality is something we want at all times, it is simply a starting point to achieve an end destination. Like I mentioned before, many people are already biased towards this forward pelvis. This is where many people, but not all, are. So we want to bring this back because then we can start to layer these other actions of internal and external rotation. If you think about how we walk or how we run or how we produce any type of locomotion activity as humans, we move from a position of external rotation to internal rotation back to external rotation. If I'm already in a position of this pelvis being forward and dumped into anterior pelvic tilt, and this is an orientation to find internal rotation, how am I going to further get the ability to internally rotate? How am I going to further get the ability to create this action to put force into the ground, because this is the relative motion and this is just simply the orientation. Also, we're going to be limited in external rotation. So if we can bring the pelvis back on both sides, that will allow us to capture some external rotation to allow us to then layer on top of that internal rotation. We can look at this as simply as walking or within gait. If we start in a position of heel strike, that is external rotation, then we move towards internal rotation and then back to external rotation upon push off. So if we want to move into internal rotation, we want to start from a position of relative external rotation, and this is generally the first thing I try to capture after restoring orientation of the pelvis, because that will allow us to get these relative motions of these segments moving on one another. So for example, if I get someone to come back and restore neutrality within their pelvis, then I want the ability for them to go from external rotation to internal rotation within mid-stance, and then allow them to move from a position of internal rotation to relative external rotation again. This also happens when we do something even as simple as a squat. If I start going down into a squat, I start in a position of external rotation, I move towards internal rotation, and then I move back into external rotation at the very bottom position of that squat. So this is not just walking and running, this carries over to many different forms of human movement, which is generally why we want to restore external rotation first. Now we can actually measure these things and use objective assessments to determine when someone has gotten back the range of motion we want so that they can then layer on the other joint actions. For example, within the pelvis, what I'm primarily concerned with first is someone's ability to go into deeper levels of hip flexion. So that means that when someone lays on the ground and pulls their leg back, they should move from a position of relative external rotation to internal rotation. At the very end range, beyond about 110 degrees, they need to go into more degrees of external rotation. So if someone can do that efficiently and effectively without compensation, then that's an indication that they are able to move through these relative motions. If someone's stuck forward within their pelvis, then we know that this person is not going to be able to bring that leg back because they're either going to get stuck within this femur and the acetabulum, or they're going to roll their pelvis underneath them as they do that hip flexion test, or it'll roll off to the side, or something will happen where we know it's not a genuine reflection of that person's ability to go through those three phases. Likewise, for shoulder flexion, the higher you go with your arm, then the deeper into that shoulder flexion that you get, and it's very similar. We start in a position of relative external rotation. At the bottom position of that shoulder flexion, our arm moves into more internal rotation as we get into about 90 degrees. And then beyond that, we start to move towards more and more external rotation. If someone can get to about 120 degrees of shoulder flexion genuinely, then that's a representation they can start in a position of ER and move towards IR. However, if we did not have the ability to get our arm overhead and go through ER to IR back to ER, what we might do as we get this arm overhead and we get stuck is we might overextend our low back and orient our entire rib cage back, which would allow us to tip the scapula back and get the arm overhead, but then that puts pressure on the low back and you're not actually getting that proper association of scapulohumeral rhythm with the scapula and also the humerus here. If you're curious to learn a couple of exercises that might help you go after whatever phase or whatever point of the progression you're in, I have a bunch of different videos on my YouTube channel about restoring external rotation, internal rotation, and also orientation of the pelvis. And I would highly recommend you check those out. I will be linking them in the description below if you're curious to check them out and see what could work for you. Now, there are exceptions to this because this is a general progression that works for most people, but there are cases in which significant asymmetries are present and maybe one hip is significantly higher than the other, tilted forward, and the orientation of the pelvis is asymmetrical. In that case, I would refer you to my lateral pelvic tilt material. I have a video and an article on that I will link below.